students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to discuss one of the most anthologized and discussed essay of 20th century, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent. As you know, T.S. Eliot was one of the most representative intellectual of 20th century, both creative and critical, a personality par excellence. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948 for representing the most difficult period of human history with its essential characteristics, the anxiety, the uncertainty, the modernity, everything is represented very minutely and very comprehensively in all his works. Not only he is the most representative poet of this period by creating immortal works like the Wasteland, the Four Quatrains, and so many. Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but also he was instrumental in reviving the poetic drama, as well as he was a prolific essay writer, and most significantly, he was the most influential critic of this period. So, Eliot, in this essay, which was published in 1919 in a literary journal called The Egoist, and later on it was anthologized in The Sacred Wood, this particular essay determined the very course of critical journey of 20th century literature. So coming to this essay, we find that this essay is having three parts. The first part deals with the concept of tradition that Eliot redefines. The second part brings out the theory of impersonality in art. And the third part is the conclusion that sums up his argument in these two contexts and the interrelationship between both tradition and impersonality of art. So let us have the look at this essay. And at the beginning of this essay is telling that every nation, every race has not only its own creative but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. So he is uh, explaining that how every nation, every race, they give more importance to their creative wealth than the critical, and most of the time they are also oblivious of the shortcomings in the critical domain. But he is emphasizing that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in that work of criticism. But Eliot is giving primacy of significance to criticism. That without criticism, there cannot be any proper appreciation of our creative wealth, our creative works. So he is telling that if we approach a poet without the prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. So, if criticism is inevitable, to appreciate a work of art in the most genuine manner, then which part of the creative work we should appreciate most sincerely? And he is telling that whenever we appreciate a poet or his work, then we try to discover within that part of the work the dead poets or the ancient poets and the artists whose influences we search for in these new works. Therefore, he is telling that the conventional concept of tradition is somewhere very much an inalienable part of our perception in appreciating the new work of art. But then, what is that tradition? So, he is telling that following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successor, tradition should positively be discouraged. But he is very much dismissive about tradition as something that is a fixity, that is just a blind and timid adherence. As in this aspect, he is definitely differing from the Victorian critic Matthew Arnold, who wanted to hand it down the tradition to the next generation. So he is telling that the conventional way of looking at the tradition is not the proper tradition. Then what, according to Eliot, is the tradition? So he is telling the tradition is basically a historical sense, that which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. So if someone continues to be a poet or continues to be an artist, growing with the work of art, must carry with him or her that sense of history, which is the most inseparable part of the tradition. And it is the historical sense that involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and with it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So he is telling, what is that historical sense? The historical sense is not only the pastness of the past, but also the presence of the past. The past in its evolutionary presentation, in its evolvement, with the chronology, we should continue with the presentness, the contemporaneity. So he is telling that this historical sense, which is a sense of timeless as well as of temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together. So this historical sense is a sense of timelessness and the temporal, the eternal and the temporal, the past and the present. Therefore, he is telling that if we apply tradition to a new work of art, we should not judge a poet or an artist alone for his comparison with any particular dead poet or past poet or artist, nor we should consider him as an imitator, how much he or she can imitate. That is not the concept of tradition we want to discover in new work of art or poetry. Rather, the necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. He is telling no. Every work of art, when it is completed, it immediately occupies a place in the chronology somewhere according to its blending or coherence with the all previous works of art. Therefore, he is telling that simultaneously to all works of art that precedes this work of art that is created, it changes the whole combination and permutation that already existed in the history of art or poetry. Therefore, he is telling it alters the relations, proportions, values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted, and this is conformity between the old and the new. So, conformity of a new work of art or a new poem or poetry is not exactly to conform to any older or existing work of art. Rather, the conformity is to alter the relations, the proportions, the values which are negotiated, readjusted. So, in this way, it conforms the old and the new. They come in the same stream of evolving tradition. So, tradition is an evolving sense of creativity, evolving sense of existence, evolving sense of the experiences of life. Then, further in his proposal, he is telling that any poet should not be judged nor amputated by them, not judged to be as good or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of the dead critics. Therefore, any new work of art or poetry should not be judged exclusively by the old canons of criticism or dead canons of criticism, nor exclusively by one particular work of art or critical theory, because it is in an evolving manner emerging and readjusting the whole existence of the body of art or poetry. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. It would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art. And when it merely conforms, it can never be considered as a new work of art. It will be considered as an imitation, an inferior imitation, not a new work of art. Therefore, he is telling that the poet or the artist should not take past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself fully on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself fully upon one preferred period. So, no artist should therefore follow or imitate one period exclusively from the history, from the tradition, nor should follow any particular poet or particular artist, nor he should be satisfied with one or two admirations instead of being considered by the whole canon that is existing there. And he is telling the poet must be very conscious of the main current. And when it will be possible, when you will not be an ordinary imitator of any particular period or person or artist and so on. He is telling when that poet or the person, the artist will be very conscious of the main current. What is the main current? When he is creating. And at the same time, what is the influence of the past on that current? how the past and the present are blended together in this main current. When he will be discovering that, then he will never be an imitator, he will be an artist. And he is telling that he must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. And the second quality he is trying to impress on the artists, the new artist, is that the new artist must always remember that art never improves. The quality of the art is always same. And if it changes, it is only the materials, means the imagery, the words, the vocabulary, but the emotions and the essential characteristic of art, they remain always same. Art is art, poetry is poetry. So in its intensity, in its essentiality, they never change. The change is only there in that material that the poet or the artist uses to create a new form of art. So he is telling that the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past awareness of itself cannot show. So the poet must blend in his presentness of consciousness, the consciousness of the past, and in the consciousness of the past, the main currents of the present, they must be properly blended and represented mutually. Then only the artist or the poet can create a genuine work of art. And further elaborating that, he is emphasizing that if someone doesn't follow this sort of blending, this sort of interaction between past and present, between the eternal and the temporal, then that particular art or the particular poem will be the poem or the art of dead or pervertive emotions or feelings. So he is telling it will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. That he is telling that if we learn lot about the past, lot about all the poets and everything, but not being conscious to the present or the spirit of the past, then it will deaden or pervert our sensibility. And he is telling further that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. And this development of the consciousness, this development of the blending of the past and the present, the eternal and the temporal, it is not only for one time. It is a continuous process. As long as the artist creates or goes on creating in his or her life, the process will go on because the artist will be getting matured by more and more observing, more and more refining this blending of the past and the present, the tradition and the main current, the eternal and the temporal. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. So, at the end of the first section of this essay, Eliot is trying to conclude or trying to justify that when the artist or the poet moves on or goes on in the way of maturity, he continuously surrenders himself as he is at the moment to something more valuable. The more he will be surrendering himself or his personality, the more he will be matured as a poet or the artist. The progress of an artist is a continual self sacrifice. Therefore, he is telling that it is a continual self sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. The personality of the poet will be extinct, gradually be extinct. He will not be visible in the work of art. The art and the artist, they will be gradually becoming more and more distinct from each other, more and more separated from each other. And that is the maturity, that is the growth. And for that, he gives an analogy from science, that is the filated platinum being introduced into a chamber uh, having oxygen and sulfur dioxide, which will result in producing sulfuric acid. But the platinum will remain inert. It will be just acting like a catalyst. So, in the next part of the essay, the second part of the essay, when he discusses about the impersonal theory, he continues from that analogy, and he is telling that this analogy is true in the case of an artist. The mind of an artist is like the catalyst, like the platinum. It doesn't change, but it brings change into the emotions and the feelings that he experiences or that he works with. So he is telling that conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author. So he is going to discuss about the relationship between the poem and the poet, the art and the artist. And he is telling that how the artist creates. The artist creates his work of art through his mind, which is the preferred medium, and it works on the very varied feelings that are at liberty to enter into new combinations. Here, if we consider the romantic critic Coleridge talked about the primary imagination and the secondary imagination, and he also said that in the secondary imagination, the mind of the poet, it takes all the variety of perceptions, varieties of impressions, and works out a new combination. So Eliot is also telling almost the same thing, that a varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combination. So the artist takes all these new images, new feelings, experiences together and transmits them into a new permutation and combination. And the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. So he is just explaining that all these impressions, perceptions, feelings, experiences, these are the materials of the poet. And his mind is the catalyst that will be creating through its own intensity. So, he is telling that the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. So the poet's mind will go on accumulating so many images, phrases, feelings, and so on, storing them up until it finds all the suitable combination parts to combine them into a new whole, a new entity, a new work of art. For it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place that counts. And he's telling that how these varied emotions, feelings, phrases, images, perceptions, they blend. They blend under the intensity, but not under the intensity of emotions or emotions of the poet, but under the intensity of the artistic process. It is the poetic emotion, not the personal emotion. The personal emotion doesn't give the new form under intensity. The poetic emotion under intensity, the poetic process, the artistic process under intensity gives form to the new form by making fusion of all these varied components that are being stored up in the mind of the poet or the artist. And he gives two examples from the earlier literature. One is the Agamemnon from Dante, where he is telling in the Agamemnon, the artistic emotion approximates to the emotion of an actual spectator. And in Shakespeare's Othello, it to the emotion of the protagonist himself. So here, nowhere the emotion of the poet Dante or Shakespeare is being exhibited or being transmuted. Rather, it is the emotion of the poet in both the cases. But the difference between the art and the event is always absolute. Therefore, he is claiming, he is asserting that the difference between art and the event is absolute. Art and life, art and the experiences of life, they are completely differentiated. Art may not represent the exact realistic emotions or the emotions of the reality. The poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. So, in this way, he is differentiating between the poetic personality and the poet's personality. That the poet's personality can never be the poetic personality, or the poetic emotion can never be the personal emotion. They must be very much distinguished from each other. Therefore, he is telling the business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones and in working them up into poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. And now he is talking about the poetic emotion. So, what is this poetic emotion? The poetic emotion, he is telling, it is not the job of the poet is not to find new emotions. The emotions of humanity are fixed. So, how the poetic emotion will be then different from the emotion of the person? Because the poetic emotion is a complex emotion. It is a complex emotion. It is a complicated emotion. It is a compound emotion. It is not the simplistic emotion of a person in real life. Therefore, he is telling that the job of the artist is to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. Even the poet who has never used nor experienced any particular emotion, for example, the emotion of a woman as a mother and the emotion of a male poet. The male poet has never experienced that emotion of a mother, but the male poet can very well depict that emotion of the mother in his poetry. So, how it will be possible? That Eliot is telling because of that impersonality of the poet. The poet is an impersonal spirit. It can enter into any emotion, and it can take any emotion into a combination to make it as a poetic emotion. And emotions which he has never experienced will serve him his turn as well as those familiar to him. The poet is equally comfortable in the emotions that he has experienced and the emotions he has never experienced. And that is the hallmark of a great poet. So, in this way, what he is telling, he is completely differing from the concept of the romantic poets who wanted to just impress that the emotion of a person is very much essential to be the poetic emotion. So he is discounting the theory of Wordsworth by telling that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality but an escape from personality. Wordsworth said that powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, but here he is telling no, poetry is not that. The experiences are not recollected and they finally unite in an atmosphere which is tranquil. Only in that it is a passive attending upon the event. So that will be a passive thing. Rather, the poet should uh, not turning loose his emotions. Rather, he should escape from the emotion. He should not bring in the personality into the work of art. Rather, he should escape the personality. So, in this way, in the second part of the essay, Eliot is creating his theory of impersonality and he is making a distinction between the art and the artist. In the third part, he is telling this essay proposes to halt at the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism and confines itself to such practical conclusions as that can be applied to the responsible person interested in poetry. So he's telling that he's not taking this theory further, he's not taking this idea further because he's not entering into the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism. Rather, he's talking about the practical conclusions which can be applied to a responsible person interested in poetry. Therefore, finally, he is asserting that the emotion of art is impersonal. So, emotion of art is impersonal. That is his findings, that is his claim. And in this way, he is giving this theory at the beginning of 20th century, and from this idea there came a lot of theories. 20th century is known as the period of critical theories, but all these theories, they are pointing their beginning to somewhere to this concept of impersonality of art. So now, from this particular text, we can find minimum two questions. One is the concept of tradition given by Eliot, and another is the concept of the art and poetry, how they differ from the artist or the poet. So here, the poet or the artist is presented as a person who is responsible for creating a complex, compound emotion within the poetry, but who is not representing his personal impressions or emotions in poetry. So here we can say that uh, if we want to again revisit the tradition, he says tradition therefore is dependent on a special kind of the historical sense, a perception not only of the pastness of the past but of its presence, and should be therefore equated with a vital realization of fact that the past and present are not two disparate segments of time but two facets of the same organism. ceaselessly conditioning and reshaping each other. It is this historical sense that compels a man to write not only with his own generation, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So, in this way, what we find that Eliot is recognizing a great literature as more than the sum of a number of great writers. Not only a number of great writers you take and you will say that this is the body of great literature. No, the great literature is something more than that, where we can find that secondary writers provide collectively and individually in varying degrees an important part of the environment of the great writer. So, a great writer will not be produced from the vacuum, he will be produced from the collective efforts of the secondary writers who have contributed their own uh, efforts in creating a vibrant tradition. And about the impersonality, we can say that uh, impersonality uh, to Eliot is the impersonality of the art. So, a writer achieves a fuller existence in his work by shearing off all personal eccentricities and oddities. And his concept of creative process often assumes the dimension of a religious experience. He seems to reaffirm in the literary context the belief that he who giveth his life on the earth shall regain it in heaven. So, in this way, he is telling that a great poet, on the other hand, always strives to transmute his personal experience into something universally valid. The poet and the man, he repeatedly asserts, are two different beings altogether. The former alchemizes the purely personal experience of the latter into an artifact of beauty and order. So, this is all about Eliot, his tradition, and individual talent.